Alright, welcome back to another web development video where I'll show you how to make modern websites using HTML5, CSS3, and a little bit of JavaScript. In this tutorial I'm going to talk again about CSS Grid, and we've learned a lot of things about how to just kind of use the tool itself, or at least the basics of it. And I think it's time that we start to transition into actually putting these layouts on the web and seeing what we can do with the layouts, with the tool that we have to create unique layouts. So we're going to look at this sort of asymmetrical layout, although it's relatively common in magazine publishing. It's not as common on the web as a pattern that you would see. So we're going to try to recreate just this left side of the page, what we see here. You could also go through and recreate this and just kind of slide it underneath, but we're just going to stick with looking at this right now, and this will help you if you wanted to go and challenge yourself to create this grid on the right side. It would help you to do that. So in Adobe XD, I've just laid out basic, what would it look like on a desktop, and this is a tablet size and this is a mobile size. So if you've never used XD, I'm not going to show you. I'm just going to show you what I laid out, and then we're going to talk about the structure of these designs and how we're going to translate that over into the code. So the way I would do this is I would just sort of break this down into columns. What sort of columns do we have? We have one column here, and we have a second column here. And you can see that we have a two column sort of structure for our what's going to be our paragraph section, kind of an article section. You could use CSS Grid if you wanted to just have these as separate columns, but I'm actually going to show you how to use CSS columns in order to have it flow from one piece of text like this to break up at a specific size into two columns like this, so that it will actually flow and be responsive. And there's just a few things that you need to do to the CSS. You don't have to actually put these inside of CSS Grid columns. So we're going to count that as one column, and then you can see there's a little bit of an indentation here. There was in the photo here too. There's a little gap, okay, where it meets the center binding, and then there's a little bit of a gap there. I don't want to create that gap using margin, although you could. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create another small column that goes right there. And so we have 1, 2, 3, 4 column layout, and that's for the desktop. And then what do we have for the tablet? So if we look over here on the tablet, we have 1. Then remember, we're just doing the two column, or doing the one single column for all of this. So realistically, we can just put some padding around this main section here, and then we can just call this a two column layout. And then on the phone version, we're just going to have a single column layout. You can see everything is just laid out one after another, and so that's going to be actually where we start, and that's going to be a pretty easy place for us to get to. This is going to be not much more difficult, and this is going to be just a little bit more challenging, but you'll see that with CSS Grid it just makes it way easier to deal with. Alright, so first let's start with this. We'll start with our mobile view, and we'll reference this again. So I come into Codepen. That's what I'm using to write the code, and we need to go ahead and create our initial HTML. And we got to make sure that when we're writing the HTML for Grid, or for any mobile styles really, that we're taking into consideration all of the things that we need to do with our code, so that we know we have some sort of a section here, a header, and then we're going to need a section here for our title, because that title is going to be a little bit separated from our content, and then we need a content section here. So those are our main three things that we need to create. And once we create them up here, they're just going to be sort of inline. Let me get this content. If you ever want some real content, I run a small, tiny project called Meaningful Ipsum. So you can find it at brianhafferkamp.github.io/meaningful-ipsum. And they're just first chapters from like some of the world's most famous stories, or at least the West's most famous stories. And you can use them for your design project. So when you want real text, you don't want lorem ipsum, but you want real meaningful stuff and not just keywords and things like that. So you can choose a story here. Christmas Carol or Pride and Prejudice, Frankenstein, Heart of Darkness, or Alice in Wonderland. If you need quotations, this one is really good because it has a lot of dialogue in it. So if for some reason you needed some text with dialogue, this one's really good. This has huge blocks of text. Alice in Wonderland also has a kind of a mixture of dialogue, and then Frankenstein also has just massive blocks of text. So you're literally able to copy and paste this text into whatever you're using, whether it's a web design or it's using something like XD. So that's all I did in XD, is I just copied and pasted a little bit of A Christmas Carol. So let's go ahead and get that text because we're going to bring it in. So let's create our elements. It's good to kind of outline, I guess, what you're going to do in the section. And the first thing that we need is we need a header, and this is going to be our hero image. And the next thing that we need is our title. So we'll call it the we'll call it article title. Doesn't have to be anything amazing. And then inside the article, actually outside the article, we're going to have just a div with the article text. You could call this part here, you could call this article, you could call this a section. I don't know. There's all kinds of ways that you could go through semantically and make this what you needed it to be. But we're going to have this just as our article text, and we lay out a p tag, and then we're just going to put some p tags in here. So it should show everything here. It's got all three of our sections. We're actually going to apply the column class to this article text. We're going to the column property, sorry, for this article text. And then for the article title, I want to have just an H1 in here. And it's going to say Marley was dead. And then for our hero image, I'm going to go ahead and put a real image. So you could also use a background image for this. So the source is going to be equal to, actually I could do, there we go. I like to go to source.unsplash.com, and you can use the Unsplash image library. It's sort of a low-level API that you can use in any website just with a link. And I prefer this one for my tutorials to do the random search term, because then you just add whatever keyword you want, and then it'll put it into the page. So you can see that it just pulls in an image, and it's using these keywords. So either every time you refresh, it's either doing nature or water. You can choose the size of the image that you want to put in. For our purposes, I'm not going to do an alt tag. So you can see every time it refreshes, there's a new image. Okay, so we have our main elements here. If we come into, let's say, 400 pixels, which is, probably going to be an average size for a phone, you see we're getting, the image, the full image here. We need to make that responsive. So now that we have our pieces, we'll go ahead and just work with our CSS a little bit. Typically, Codepen puts a little margin on everything, so I don't know if they still do that. It doesn't look like it. So I'm just going to put that in there anyway. We want to make our images responsive, so the width is equal to 100%. Okay. And you can see now, you know, just with our mobile styles, we're almost there. We can do a few things to the text itself. Let's add, we'll call this main. That way we can style this whole section. So we're going to call this main, and we're going to say it has a padding of 1 rem all around. So that hits this text section here and gives it a little padding. You could even do 0 on the top and bottom if you wanted, and then just do 1 around, because you're going to get some padding from, or some margin and padding from this H1. And there's also going to be a little bit here down at the bottom of this P tag. So you could just try to even that out a little bit. And you can see right now that we have essentially what we were looking for with our mobile styles, right? Let's see if they have, I'm using Merriweather Sans. Let's see if they have that. In Codepen, if you go to your assets and you go to fonts, there are some preloaded fonts here. They don't have Merriweather Sans, but we could use, let's say, Open Sans. And then you can either copy the link to put it into the head section of the document, or you can just import it straight into the CSS. So the way you do that is you copy and paste that up here. I'm using SAS, so I don't need the semicolon. But now you've imported this particular font family. You could do the same thing. I'll show you how to combine these two. So you can take this Merriweather, and I believe I can just do like this. Put a little pipe there, and then I think that's how it does it in Google Fonts. You can test that. Oh, sorry, you can also copy the font family declarations. So let's check that they're in here. Now you can just put those wherever you need to put them inside of your code. Okay, so it looks like our changes up here did work. So if we comment that out, we can see that we get the Open Sans. I'm gonna make the Merriweather the common font, and then for our H1 we're just gonna have this Open Sans font. So we'll have the serif font for our text, and then the sans serif font for here. While we're here, let's go and make a text transform uppercase. And what else do we have? We'll improve the leading a little bit here. Leading is just the space between each line, and so we do that by saying line height. And I'm just going to say 1.2, 1.5. Alright, I like that a little better. It feels a little bit more open. What does 4 look like? Yeah, 4 is a little bit tighter. I think the tighter is going to look a little bit better on when the size gets out and we start to get into this column structure. I think the tighter lines are actually going to look better. So let's just make them 1.5 now, and then maybe if we need to tighten them up, we can. And then I don't like the color here, so I'm just going to change the color to something a little lighter, like a 444, which is a sort of a dark gray. And you can see here, you know, everything is totally responsive at this point. So if you have a real tiny screen like 320, you know, this would be a this would be like an iPhone 4, iPhone 5, and then you're getting out into the larger phones out here. So everything looks good. I would say maybe 600. That's where we'll set our first breakpoint. Okay, and at our first breakpoint, we need to get it looking like this. Remember, we have a 2-column structure, and then but we have 3 elements, so we're going to have to do something with the image to make it span across the different elements. And so our grid is going to be contained here in our main, and then the section and the article are going to be a part of our grid structure. And like I said, we're going to need to create a different sort of column sort of structure for this, so we can do that. And then technically we could include our hero in there. We don't need to, because our hero is taking up the full space all the time. It's not ever it doesn't ever need to be a part of the grid. So when I'm looking at it now, I can see that this can be outside of the grid, and then our grid starts here. I'm for simplification, so I would not make a grid more complicated than it needs to be. If something like this doesn't need to be in the grid structure, I would not put it in the grid structure. One other thing I want to do is make this main maximum width of 1250 pixels, and then we'll just put an auto margin on that. And what that does, it makes sure that it doesn't am I missing on it? Well, I feel like something's not catching on here. Oh, it is catching. It's catching down here. I want it to contain the whole thing, so let's just put that on the body. You could also create so there we go. You also create a separate class here. Sometimes I'll create a section called app, and app is just a container that holds everything. So get that spacing right, and then we'll come up here, and that has an ID of app, and then app just sort of can be a catch-all for all of the content to separate it from the body. That way, if you wanted to make the body background a little bit of a different color, you could do that. So that gets us where we need to be for that. And I can already see at that size we're getting this 1 rem of padding on the edge that we're probably not going to want, so I have to remember that for later. Okay, so let's move on to our tablet styles, and at 600 pixels we want to have a 2-column structure, so 1 column and 2 columns. And so we come up here and we say that's going to be for our main. So at media and a minimum width of 600 pixels, and we might have to manipulate that size a little bit, but we have to start somewhere. So let's get it out here. Okay. So at 600 pixels, we want to display main as a grid. So we're going to say display grid, and then we need to set our columns. So we say grid template columns. The first column is going to be, oh gosh, I don't know, what is this? We'll say 250 pixels. No, let's do like 150. 150 pixels and then 1 FR. Let's try that and see. Oh, we have to declare what it is. It has to be main, sorry. Okay. Alright. So here we're seeing, maybe this can be 200. Oh, not 2000. Okay, maybe that's a little bit better. So when we get here to 600, then we get this sort of column structure. Now we can try to squeeze out 2 small columns, or we can just be happy with what we have here. At this, we need to make this right aligned. You can see that this becomes right aligned. It's left aligned here. So let's go to our H1 and we'll just copy this media query. And then we'll say for our H1, we want it to be text align to the right. Okay. We need to create some grid gap here inside of our grid. So we'll say grid gap of 2 rem. That's what I had in the the design up here. I had 2 rem. And you could even just do grid column gap if you wanted to, and that only separates the columns. It doesn't separate any of the rows. We only have 1 row, so it's not that big a deal, but we could set that properly. And then we're getting a little bit of margin here on the top, so let's just shave that off. So a margin top of 0, and we're getting some margin. Actually, we can just make it 1 rem, and that should bring it, yeah, that should bring it down. You get 1 rem of, so 16 pixels of margin on the top of your paragraph tags, and I think 16 on the bottom. So if you ever see that something is not lining up well, you can just give it a margin of 16 and it should line up. 16 pixels is 1 rem. Okay, so we're looking pretty good here, and it's looking exactly like we had put it here, except that there's a 2-column structure. Now what we can do is, you know, once we get out to about here, so 768, you're starting to get some line widths that maybe you don't want to have. You see how it just gets longer and longer? So that's not exactly what we're looking for. So let's say at 768, well, we don't even need to do that. We can just go ahead with our P, and we can say, we can do this a couple of ways. We can leave it like it is right now, and then put a media query. So we say at media and a min width of 768 pixels. Then we can do P, and we'll say columns 2. And so once we get out to 768, we get a 2-column structure. So that might be just the easiest way to go. You can also determine the column width, and the column width can be, you know, 400 pixels, so that each column, it doesn't split into 2 columns until the columns can be 400 pixels wide. So as we go out, you see it takes a while to get to that 2-column sort of structure, depending on the column width. I'm not sure what the default is on this. I find that, you know, like 300 works well. So when you get out here, you're at 900 pixels, and if you don't get out that far, then it just stays as 1 column. But you can see that the whole thing is, it's actually, I put that on the wrong one. Let's put it on the article text. You see how we're getting a split for each individual paragraph. Let's put this on article text. Sorry. So now this will split all of the paragraphs, not each individual paragraph, but it'll split them as a whole. Okay. So now you can see that we scroll down, Scrooge is dead, so dreadfully cut up by the sad event. So it moves from this bottom up to this top section. If we take this off, then we get those columns for a lot longer. So it just sort of, whatever the default is probably okay. I like to control the column, I want to say, is it called column gap? Let's make it kind of extreme. Yeah, it's called column gap, and you can control the space between the columns. If we wanted 3 columns here, we could do that. You see how that works? If you wanted 4, God forbid, you put 4 columns in this, it just gets hard to read. But if the gap is only 1 rem, it's not so bad. But we're going to go with just a 2-column structure, and we're going to say 2 rem for the column gap. Now, one of the things when you're working with paragraphs and you're splitting them into columns is you're always going to get this little kind of a bump here. Remember, I told you all of the p tags have a margin on top of 1 rem or 16 pixels. Over here it doesn't have that because this is not the beginning of a p element. The p element starts here, but you're getting kind of overflow essentially from here up to here. So what we want to do is we need to go to p, and we need to say and first of type, and we need to say margin top of 0. And so the first of the p events, or the p elements, the first of that type of element, we're going to remove the top margin. So it doesn't remove the margin from any of these. If we were to do that, then it would change, I think it would change most everything, at least a little bit. Can't see it as pronounced, but I think it would change all of those. So let's just do the first of type, and then we'll pull that up a little bit. Now you can see that we should have just taken that off. So let's go back and we'll remove that margin top. Actually, let's just make it 0. And so now we have everything in line. It's all lined up according to the top, which is what we're looking for here. This is all kind of lined up together. And then we can control the padding in this space. So we had a padding of 1 rem on each side, but what we want now is maybe we can create either 1 rem all the way around, which is okay, or we could do 2 rem top and bottom, and then we have a little bit of space here and here. You can see that there's always going to be a little bit of space over here, so it just creates a little bit of breathing room. Space is your friend when you're designing, and it also shows that you know what you're doing. So if you are not controlling the space very well in your designs, then people are going to be able to see that either you're not as skilled a designer, or maybe you just don't have as much experience seeing how the white space can really help you. Okay, this is not bad. You know, this is okay because it really sets this off and it allows you to see all the text. So this is not a bad thing to have, that sort of white space. You could even push this farther on the top and the bottom because there's so much space here. You could really push that a little bit. So if we said even 4, you know, that might not be too much, like 4 and 2, because it's just it's so much white space over here. That's the thing. Alright, so now we have our column structure. We get to 600, then we get some space, and we get our 2-column layout. And then once we get here, you can see that it's mostly what we want. We're going to need to kind of control this column a little bit, and we're going to need to control this column a little bit, because now we only have 2 columns, but we really want 4. Alright, so we need this one over here, and we need this little small sliver of a column over here. And we can easily do that using CSS Grid. So we're going to make that happen at, let's say, let's say what? Yeah, we can try it at 900. So we go back to our grid here, and then we lay out a new media query. And so instead of our 2-column structure, we want to turn that into a 4-column structure. So we choose our main element. We don't need to display grid anymore. I don't like this, by the way. I'm going to go like 3rem, 2rem, something like that. 4 was a little much for me. So we're going to stay with our column. Our column gap stays the same. It's this part here that needs to change. So we need to actually create more. We need to create more columns. So not just the 2, we need to make 4 columns. So the first one, it's not exact. Let's say it's 300. We'll just try it. And then our last one we'll say is I think it's 60 pixels. So we'll create 4 columns. This one we can say 1FR, and we can make it a little bit more free and open. So some of this is really just kind of look and feel. You could even say something like 25%. So our first column is going to be 25%. The column here can still remain at 200 pixels. And then this column we can say is 1FR. Will that work? I think that'll work. Let's manipulate our let's see. Show you a little trick. If you go out to whatever browser you're using and you go to the inspector, and then you choose the element that you're looking at. Main is our element that has the grid on it. So if you select main, you can see that there is a 4-column grid setup, and it's set up, mostly like we want it. But what we need to do is we need to manipulate these items into the correct parts of the grid. So we can actually choose where we want to put each of these. So we want this first part here to go here into the second column. So we'll say that it's in column 2, and then this needs to go over into column 3. So let's do that inside the code. So our first item is, what is it called? It's called article title. It's our H1, and we'll just say article title. This is the first time we're really having to style that particular block. And I'll use this media query here. So at 900 pixels wide, we want it to, we're going to use something called grid column. And grid column tells whatever this element, it tells it what space on the grid that it needs to be in. So where does it need to start and where does it need to end? You can do it a couple ways. You can say 2. That automatically pushes everything over. And so it puts it into grid column 2. I'll show you. If we refresh this, and now when we look at it, you can see that it moved it over into grid column 2. You could also say starts at grid column 2 and it goes till grid column 3. Which is exactly like saying grid column 2. You could also make it go across to 4 so that it takes up 2 columns and kind of spans 2 columns. For our purposes, we just want to put it into column 2. And then I'm going to explicitly tell this text to go into column 3. I don't think that I necessarily need that, but I'm going to do it anyway. So let's use this media query, and we'll do article text, and we'll say grid column 3. Since the flow of the column is to put this here into column 2, it reflows everything to the next column over. So we didn't really need to explicitly set that because it's already happening over here. You can see that it's already pushed it over to column 3. But I think I would feel comfortable just making sure that that's in there. And then last, we can control the we need to either control this gap over here, or we can just control this this little bit of what's it called, the last column. So, or we can control the padding, because you can see that we don't need the padding on here necessarily. Remember, I told you we could manipulate that padding once we got out to our destination width, right? You could leave it like that, it's not too bad. But let's go ahead and control the padding like we talked about before, and that's on main. So at 900 pixels, when we go to this 4-column layout, we're also going to call the padding 0. So let's just say padding of 0. Well, 0 left and right. Let's still do the 2 rem top and bottom. Oh, actually, what was it? It was 3 rem. So let's make it 3. Okay. So all we're doing is getting rid of the padding that's on the side. So when I refresh this, you can see that the padding on the side has gone away, and it gives us a little bit truer representation of what we were looking for. So now you see that we have this really nice sort of asymmetrical layout with the heading here. It'd be very easy to just put in the name and all of your meta information here if you were writing a blog post. And then you have this 2-column structure here, which is really just one grid column, but we're using CSS columns in order to create that. So we use our CSS columns here on the article text, and so anything under article text is going to be reflowed into those 2 columns. And you can see as we move down, then we're over here to our 2-column structure. So now there's 1 column here, 1 column here, and then we've lost our 2 columns in here automatically because the width of each column has been it hasn't been reached yet. It doesn't reach it until, you know, about that point there, 770 pixels. Otherwise, it's going to give us 1 single column, which I really love about the CSS columns. And then once you get down to phablet or phone sizes, you just get this very generic sort of single column structure. And you can see it in the browser here. We start out here. Nope. What messed up? Suppose nothing messed up. Let's check it out. I don't know why it's displaying like that. Okay. Oh. For some reason, it's kicking right into our column structure. Why is it doing that? Because it's not doing it here, so I'm not sure what that's about. Maybe it's just something with that debug view. Anyway, so here's our small phones. This is 120 pixels, and as we move out to our different devices, we get this nice 2-column layout. And then as we get out a little farther, then our bigger grid is kicked in, so we're getting a lot more space out here, and we're getting a little space over here. And then when we reach our maximum width, it just it doesn't flow out past that, right? So when we get onto a bigger size, we still keep our grid structure. So that's creating an asymmetrical grid using CSS Grid, and also showing you how to do the column structure as well. So hopefully that's been sort of instructive for you to see how a grid can take shape that's a little bit asymmetrical and not just your typical, repeat 4 columns, 1 FR, and creating the same sort of thing over and over again, which grid is great for, but there's also so many more possibilities for designing things like this, which are a little bit more designerly, and they're not going to happen the exact same way because we have to consider responsive layouts and things like that, but there is a way for us to create those experiences at particular breakpoints when we know that people are going to be coming to our website, especially at particular breakpoints. So if you're looking in your analytics and you see that there's a lot of desktop users, you might want to put a little bit more emphasis and design into your desktop experience, just so that they can have the best. Or if they want to come to your site and read, they might find it a lot easier to be able to read a column structure like this that you can easily scan and move through, as opposed to having huge blocks of text, which maybe feel a little bit intimidating. So you can see that there's a lot of text here, but we have so much white space out here that it draws a lot of attention to the text, but it also makes it feel not quite so daunting to read. So something to think about, something to consider, and CSS Grid helps us get there. And because you can manipulate where these elements are in the grid, you can do pretty much whatever you want to do. I haven't seen too many magazine layouts that I have not been able to reproduce. I'm sure there are some, but the limitations have kind of gone off for layout design on the web. So if you have any questions or comments, please leave them down in the comments section below. I'd love to hear them and to hear your thoughts on CSS Grid. It's a real game changer in the layout business of the web, because we can manipulate those things. We can manipulate columns, and we can manipulate structure just in the CSS itself, which is a huge advantage now, without having to do any sort of framework or marking everything up. You can see you can see how little markup there is to create such a complex style. There's no extra column classes or anything. There's no need for any of that kind of stuff. So hopefully this has been very instructive for you. If you want to get notifications for more of my videos, then subscribe to the channel. I'm up over 4,000 subscribers now, so I'm very happy about that, and it's been a long time coming, but I'm happy to be sort of at that plateau. If you like this video, please share it if you think that it will be helpful to your colleagues or helpful to anyone in your network, and share my channel as well. I have more CSS Grid and CSS Flexbox videos, so if you're interested in learning more about how to do basic and advanced things with those two new technologies, then check out my channel and see if there's something there for you. Well, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.